Boldwood presents The Daughter-in-Law, written by Nina Manning and read by Candida Gubbins and Helen Keeley. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. I sat very still and felt the fear wash through me as the reality of the situation became clear. Little shots of pain pulsated around my body. My abdomen contracted. I felt dizzy and realized that at any point I could lose consciousness. I never thought it would be so easy to surrender myself. But teetering on the edge here, I was faced with a choice. Carry on, or give up. I tried to cast my mind back to a time when everything made sense, but I couldn't remember when that was. He was supposed to save me. Now I was lost and another part of me was missing. What was the point in fighting anymore? Where could I go from here? I knew I deserved this. It had been inevitable. I had gotten away with it for too many years. This was my comeuppance. Yet somewhere deep within me, a spark was still ignited. If I concentrated hard enough, I could feel it whirring quietly, like a small vibration. An instinct was pushing me forward, forcing me to fight and recover what was mine. It was a desire that was becoming more urgent. I knew what I needed to do, and somehow I would try to push past the weight of despair to find my way to the light again, to find my way to my love, and to the beautiful gift that was stolen from me.
Annie. My favourite room is the spare bedroom at the front of the house. It gets all the light in the morning and looks so inviting. I've done it up like a picture I saw in a lifestyle magazine. A checked throw across the end of the bed, floral sheets and hooked back curtains, a little wicker chair in the corner with a few well-read paperbacks stacked on top of it, and a white vase on the bedside table. It really is the most comforting place to be. Of course, no one ever uses it. I like to keep the house looking nice, but it was only ever going to be me and my son. Getting out of bed was particularly hard this morning. It has been every morning since Ben left. I keep thinking, what is the point? I've been feeling that empty hopelessness for several months now, since Ben deserted me. For her. I'd heard all about empty nest syndrome, but I never imagined for a moment it would happen to me. I never actually thought he would leave. I thought we would just keep existing together, forever. He kept so much of his stuff here initially that I felt sure he would return, but just last month he came and took the lot. It's so quiet here now. It was quiet anyway. That's why I took the house. It's the house I grew up alone in with my father, but fled from as soon as I was able to support myself. How do you define an unhappy childhood? In those days, it was unheard of to make an allegation about your relative. I accepted the violence. It was, after all, part of him, and all I had ever known. Throughout my motherless upbringing, the beach house provided a sanctuary for me with plenty of places to hide. I got stealthier as I grew, and with my legs pulled up tightly into my chest and my head pressed to my knees, I would squeeze myself into an alcove, the airing cupboard or the shed, with the ringing sound of my father's threats in my ear. Later on I would sneak out and find my way back to my bedroom past my father's drunken snores. The next day he wouldn't remember a thing. Had I not been able to escape down to the shore to skim pebbles or poke about in rock pools, then I would have run away sooner. The sea kept me safe. But as soon as I turned 16, I took myself hundreds of miles away. I never heard a whisper from my father, who had told me daily I reminded him too much of my brazen excuse of a mother. Then he was dead, and the beach house was mine. I left it sitting empty for a while, too scared to return, too busy trying to salvage my own marriage. Then Ben arrived, and I knew it was time. When I returned here all those years later with my son, it was fairly run down and rotting in places I couldn't get to, much like my father for all those years. The brown, weather-worn cladding needed a sand down and varnish, and the white-framed windows were peeling, but overall the exterior wasn't so bad. I did the best I could with it, and I could overlook most of the natural decay when I scanned the vast horizon and breathed in the fresh sea air. It's a remote spot, perched right on the edge of the peninsula, before it slopes round into the sea. Standing in the garden or looking out of the window, you would be forgiven for thinking there were no houses for miles, but there is one around along the shore and to the left, and then they began to scatter more frequently as they feed towards the village. People rarely walk this far down, as the shore is a little more rustic, with huge pieces of driftwood and great mounds of seaweed washing up daily. Besides, the stretch of beach at the end of the garden and over the low, battered wall essentially belongs to me. We are protected a little from the wind by a few surrounding trees, but it does get a little breezy here at times. But when it's still, and the sea looks like a flat piece of mirror you could walk across, that's when I love it the most. Of course, I love the waves, too, especially the ferocious ones that thrust themselves towards the wall. I like to watch those waves and feel my own fury in them. A house on the seafront, much like a savannah plain, is the perfect spot to see when enemies are approaching, and anyone who tries to come between me and my son, I consider an enemy. But, despite the weather and the waves, I know the house is empty, and although I try to fill my days with mundane, daily tasks, I too feel empty. I need to feel fulfilled again. I need my son back where he belongs. There's no one downstairs humming a tuneless song while they make their breakfast. There are no dirty trainers in the hallway, or piles of washing in the laundry basket. There are no toast crumbs on the kitchen side, or butter streaks in the Marmite. The house is so eerily quiet. I've never experienced this. Not since having Ben. I forced all the bad memories away from the time I lived here as a child and made it all about me and Ben. It's our sanctuary, our hub, our place away from the world. Now he's gone. He hardly texts or rings. She has him wrapped around her little finger, calling all the shots, no doubt. It was a real shock when Ben told me he'd met someone. It was more of a shock when he told me he'd gone and gotten himself married. He'd been spending a lot of time at her house, that I knew, but I had no idea things had evolved so quickly, and to have done it without telling me, his own mother first. We used to be so close. I'm not coping so well. I did the right thing, of course. I invited them over for something to eat, mostly because I needed to get a good look at the woman who thinks she has replaced me. But I know it's only temporary. I can't be replaced. My son can't live without me. The thought of her coming into my house tomorrow, The woman, who I have never met, who has taken my son away from me, was almost too much to bear. But I caught the despair before it developed into something more distressing, and just felt thankful that Ben was coming home to see his mum. I stood in the front spare room, letting the light from the morning sun heal me all over. The faint, salty smell from the shore just a few feet away creeps through the open window. I could hear the gentle lap of the waves, and I like the way a little of nature sneaks inside. Even on a bitter winter's day like today, this room brings with it a feeling of hope, a promise that today will be the day. It's encouraging me to feel something, and I can. Just about. The sun edges around the house to my bedroom later in the day, at different hours, depending on the season, and occasionally I take my time to lie down and bask in its glorious rays. I almost go into a state of meditation. I'm not a meditator. I wouldn't even know if I was doing it right. But something about it feels so relaxing that it must be doing something to my soul. I looked out of the window at the ocean, at the way the morning light glitters across the tips of the waves. It still fills me with awe and a profound sense of invigorating peace. I couldn't possibly be anywhere else but here. I chose well when I decided to raise a family here. Ben and I made some glorious memories. I like to get out at least 2 or 3 times a week. Since retiring from the pharmaceutical business a few years ago, I have endless units of the day to fill. Of course, when Ben was here, I filled it with tending to his needs. Now, it's just me and the sudden spate of time before me every day. I drove my little blue Fiat car into the village, found a space in one of the bays and took my basket into the small greengrocer's. It's so nice that certain things just stay the same. I've been going there for over 20 years, and it is still owned by the same lady that owned it back then. I walked into the grocer's and heard the sound of the bell above the door let out its familiar ping. June looked up from behind the counter and beamed one of her smiles. "Hello, Annie." "Hello, June." I walked over to the vegetables and started placing items into my basket, all the while thinking about what I would cook tonight. I've been so used to whipping up meals for the 2 of us that now I find cooking for one difficult. Ben has such an appetite that it was like cooking for a family of 4. He would always go in for 2nd and 3rd helpings and finished up the leftovers without hesitation. So I started to freeze meals, my intention being that every time Ben visits, I can send him off with a batch of homemade food. But he hasn't visited, not for over a month, and I cannot conceal the contempt I feel, the anger that begins in the pit of my stomach and then consumes me, so I feel the need to run out to the wall at the bottom of the garden and scream into the vast ocean. I can't imagine for a moment that Ben's new wife has time to stand and cook a meal at the stove like I do. Of course, I couldn't always cook. There was a time when cooking terrified me, but I had to do it. It was expected of me, and once I began, I enjoyed it. Being able to create something from raw ingredients and watch it develop into something wholesome and magnificent is truly a satisfying experience. "Any tomatoes today?" June hollered, wrenching me from my thoughts. "Got some lovely ones over here." She pointed to a large box of ripe red tomatoes next to her. "Oh yes, go on then." I walked over to the counter. "I'll take 6. I thought about Ben as I watched June choosing the tomatoes and how he loved one grilled for his breakfast. "How's things today, Annie?" June took a brown paper bag and started dropping the shiny red fruit into it. "Oh, you know, same as," I said, as I looked away from her and out of the window. "How's that boy of yours getting on then?" I began imagining Ben as a small boy, when he would run around this very grocery store and help me count out the vegetables. "Yes, you know, same as usual." I felt a pang in my stomach, a gut-tightening feeling, and I was overcome for a moment with sadness that Ben wasn't that little boy anymore, that June couldn't comment on his floppy dark locks and tell me he was the apple of my eye, and I would nod and say, yes, he was my everything. "They are so busy at this age, aren't they? Flitting about, no time to think of anyone but themselves." I nodded. Yes, but he loves his mum. I didn't even consider that I should share the news about his marriage. Or the other news. June smiled at me and handed me the brown paper bag. I left the grocer's with the dinging of the bell in my ears. As I stepped out of the shop, I turned right to go to the butcher's. Between the grocer's and the butcher's was a small electrical store selling LED TVs and docking stations and all the modern appliances young people couldn't live without these days. As far as I was concerned, the shop was an eyesore. And as for that colossal TV screen in the window, I mean, who needs a 60-inch television in their lounge? But today, as I passed, I couldn't help but turn my head to look at the image showing on the TV that towered above me, and suddenly, something was so very familiar. I tripped slightly, and the basket slipped from my fingers. I didn't look down at the tomatoes that had fallen out, but I knew the ripe fruit would now be a red, smashed mess around my feet. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. I could feel bile rising in the back of my throat, and I thought I could very well be sick. The size and imposition of the TV was instrumental in showing in full HD colour a news report with the headlines underneath. And above that, the face of the person I'd hoped I would never see again.
Daisy. "Hi, Mum," Ben sang, and fell into his mother's arms as she patted his back as though she were winding a baby. It was early December, and I was practically shivering by the time we had reached the front door, where Annie was already poised ready to greet us. I stood and patiently waited. I watched with intrigue as Annie took her son in her arms and ignored all presence of me over his shoulder. I could hear a different voice coming from him, one he obviously only reserved for her, and I tensed at the sound of it. Something about it unnerved me. It was a new tone to me, a part of Ben I had never seen or heard before. I had tried so desperately to uncover every piece of my husband, so there were no surprises after rushing to get to know him. Perhaps in my haste, there were things I had missed. Finally, she released her son, and I took my cue. I walked into the tiny porch, the sea breeze whipped my hair across my face, and I pulled the stray strands behind my ear. The sun, which had been eking its way through a cluster of clouds when we arrived, was gone, casting everything in a gloomy grey light. Behind me, a lone seagull let out a desolate cry. It was clear the saltwater-worn porch could not comfortably accommodate all three bodies, but there we huddled regardless. My arms were pressed firmly to my side, and I listened as Ben rambled a ridiculously extravagant introduction, something about me being the second most important woman in his life. I watched as Annie, with her lips tightly sealed, flicked her eyes up and down me in one swift movement. It was as though she barely looked at me at all. She then rested her gaze upon my face, and her tight pout dissolved into a broad smile. "Hello, Daisy. It's nice to meet you." Annie spoke politely and confidently as she held out her hand towards me. Without hesitation, I grabbed it and shook it, only realising afterwards how quickly I had responded. I stepped back, slightly flabbergasted at my own speed to appease her. My palm buzzed from the pressure of Annie's firm handshake. Based on the photograph I had seen of her, I'd expected to be warmly embraced by the woman who was now my mother-in-law. Ben talked about his home life. I knew how he was raised, but he rarely spoke of his mother. He merely showed me a photo. She looked fluffy, as though she had a wholesome chuckle. Maybe someone who would wrap you in her arms with real affection. But it was apparent that looks could be deceiving. I knew more than anyone that trying to paint on a smile every day was a tiresome task, and some days you just couldn't succeed. Annie presented an air of glamour with her sleek brown bobbed hair, with only a smattering of very light grey that resembled highlights from a distance. She was dressed younger than her 60 years, in a perfectly pressed white shirt and blue jeans. But her smile was merely her face scrunched up so her eyes became little slits, through which she could safely view me. We had driven for just over 40 minutes from our flat in town to Annie's beach house, almost entirely in silence. I'd allowed Ben to drive my car, a silver Renault Clio. I loved my little car, and when he moved in, I was worried he might insist we switch it for something more manly. But he seemed content driving it. He was a careful driver, meticulous and completely focused, never wavering to look at anything other than what was in front of him. We were minutes away from arriving, when Ben turned into a dusty track, which would lead down to the house, on the beach, and quietly announced we would arrive in less than 1 mile. Panic pulsed through my body. For it was now only 5 months since Ben and I had met, that we were on our way to meet the woman I would come to know as my mother-in-law. We had been so wrapped up in our bubble that it didn't occur to me to wonder why Ben had waited so long to introduce us. It hadn't fazed me. We didn't need anyone else intruding into our perfect world. We were happy as just us. Families made everything complicated. Now as I stood here, seeing her in the flesh, I could tell there was a coarseness to Annie. Her face was a myriad of untold stories and emotions, something which that momentary captured image neglected to show. I looked at Annie's starched white shirt, and then looked down at my faded grey t-shirt with the Rolling Stones tongue and lip logo, and the baggy green combat trousers with the top button that I could no longer do up. I took comfort in my sacred red heels I religiously wore, knowing I would only be able to wear them for a few more weeks before they became uncomfortable. Today, as I met my mother-in-law for the first time, I hoped they were the little sparkle of distraction I needed, for I was conscious that my bulging abdomen was an awkward representation of exactly how long Ben and I had been together. A life that was created the night we met almost 5 months ago. That extra hour I had convinced Ben to spend in bed with me had taken its toll. I looked down at my own unplanned outfit that I had grappled around for at the last minute. I hadn't expected her to have this sort of impact on me. Was Annie looking past the veneer? If she was, then she didn't need to look very hard. I could feel my guard had not only slipped, but was disintegrating with every second that she looked at me. I had a feeling I was getting sussed out, and I didn't like the way I suddenly felt so exposed. I watched as Annie's gaze was drawn down to my abdomen. The baby bump was apparent, and taut skin was slightly exposed under my t-shirt that had edged its way upwards. I could feel her look of disdain, but Annie didn't say a word about the human life that was growing within me, her own flesh and blood. "You're late, son. That's unusual of you." Annie flashed a look my way. "Sorry, Mum. Traffic," Ben said. I watched Annie's contorted smile as Ben hopped from one leg to another like a restless child. "Oh, for goodness sake, Ben, get through into that lounge." Annie gave an elaborate shooing motion with both hands before turning to me. Her fake smile faded, and it seemed she could do nothing to stop it. I saw the realization spread across her face, manifested as a sort of flickering of her head, and then watched as she desperately tried to drag that smile back. There was a searching in her eyes. I could see her mind mulling something over very quickly, and then she looked at me with intent, as though she knew me. Panic surged through my veins. It wasn't possible, I reassured myself. Annie spoke, but it was too loud for the situation. Come on through then. She held one hand out to guide me into the house. I followed Ben as Annie closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I found myself in a large, stark hallway on wooden floorboards with doors leading off in several directions. I stood looking along the walls for pictures or photographs, but there was nothing that stood out. No statement pieces that suggested a mother and her son had lived here all their lives. I usually relished arriving at a new house and looking around, trying to piece together a story about the person. But this house was not giving away any clues. There's no room to swing a cat in that porch. Come through, get settled, and I'll get you a cup of tea. Annie whittled away as she walked in behind us. Following Ben, I found myself in a large lounge with huge windows that showed a shingle beach just beyond a wall at the end of a garden. Ben took a seat on one of the two small distressed sofas that were facing each other. Annie waited for us both to be seated, and then walked out of another door opposite me into what I presumed was the kitchen. I busied myself getting comfy on the sofa opposite Ben. Neither of us removed our jackets. The chill from outside lingered in my bones. I looked at Ben. He gave a small wink, and I smiled back. I found myself relaxing a little as I sat back and took in my surroundings. It was the epitome of a classic beach house, spacious, brilliant views of the sea. The decor was a little dated. The faded floral design on the sofas was evidence that Annie had not updated her interiors for a good few years, if ever. The house seemed far too large for just one woman to live in all alone. But then, of course, up until a few months ago, Ben had been here too. There was a fireplace to my left, central to the two sofas, and above it, a long wooden mantelpiece. On one of the large windowsills was a green vase with some fake flowers. Scattered around were plaques which read statements such as, "Home is where the heart is." My eyes were drawn to a smaller plaque, perched upon the mantelpiece above the fireplace. I focused hard on the writing, which was just within reading distance. The bond between mother and son is a special one. It remains unchanged by time or distance. It is the purest love, unconditional and true. It is understanding of any situation and forgiving of any mistake. It was the sort of thing that would be a gift, and I wondered if Ben had bought it for Annie. I sat back and took in more of the room. I looked out through the window, my eyes drawn to the sight of the ocean. I realised I didn't take advantage of living so close to the sea. Or perhaps I had never seen it looking so vivid and inviting as it did from Annie's window. I noted there was no television in the lounge, no hi-fi system or radio either, just an old solitary turntable in the corner of the room. It was deafeningly quiet. Annie arrived back into the room and punctuated the silence. She was struggling with a tray laden with tea, a selection of foil-wrapped biscuits, and a fresh-looking Victoria sponge cake. Annie placed the tray onto the coffee table in the middle of the two sofas and positioned herself carefully next to me. She let out a loud sigh, accompanied by a small smile. I looked at the tray, keen to be of assistance and show willing. I leant in towards the teapot. "I'll be mum then," I said jovially. But before I could reach the pot, Annie intercepted. Suddenly I found that my hand was pressed against the scalding pot. I immediately felt the searing heat penetrate through my fingers before I had time to retract. I sucked my breath in through my teeth as the sting from the heat resonated through my fingers. I looked anxiously at Annie, who now had both hands on the pot ready to pour, seemingly oblivious. "Don't you worry yourself, dear. You just sit back and relax," Annie said softly, without taking her eyes off the teapot and cups. This is some of my best crockery, you know, Daisy. Annie poured out and handed me a small white china teacup and saucer. She turned back and poured another cup. I slowly sat back and cradled my tea, gently stroking my index and middle fingers where the fuzzy feeling still remained. Something was preventing the words that were appropriate to the situation from forming in my mouth. I could feel agitation rising through my chest. I looked up at Ben, who had his eyes firmly locked on the screen of his new BlackBerry phone, a device he was clearly quite taken with. He had apparently missed the whole incident. Annie handed me a cup and saucer, without looking at me. Help yourself to milk and sugar, dear. Oh, and I made this cake. Ben's favourite. Did you know? Annie's eyes were wide open and reminded me of the saucer I held in my hand. No, I didn't. I looked into my teacup. Oh, yes. Been making Victoria sponge cake for years, haven't I, son? It is a special occasion, after all, isn't it? She said. Her face remained fixed upon the coffee table. I took a sip of tea and found that my hand shook and caused a ripple of clinking china, which attracted a brief look from Annie. I was now completely on edge and shot a glance over towards Ben, urging him to look up and rescue me. But he was too absorbed in his phone. The new millennium had brought with it a necessity for technology, somewhere tangible to store more things that people didn't want others to see, a concept I wasn't yet wholly comfortable with. You're starting to show, I see. Was it planned? Annie's tone reeked of distaste. Annie's facetious comment hung in the air. I hadn't expected to get pregnant during the first week of knowing Ben. I don't think Ben had quite realised the enormity of it yet. He was going through the motions, asking the right questions. At a time when I was struggling to feel anything for the baby, I was glad Ben had yet to make any emotional connection either. Annie continued. I didn't realise first-time mum showed so much at this stage. And you realise babies are expensive, don't you, Daisy? How are you going to manage on Ben's wage as a musician? He only works the odd weekend. I could hear the authority in Annie's tone, as though she was the only woman who had ever raised a child. I said nothing, but flashed a small smile. What was there to say? We hadn't really discussed the ins and outs. We just knew it felt right, and it would all work itself out. If I ever raised money issues with Ben, I was pretty sure his response would be to tell me that love would find a way. But I didn't care to say those words out loud to Annie. I sipped my tea and clinked the cup back into the saucer, taking care to do so as quietly as I could. There was a small gold antique clock on the mantelpiece, which seemed to tick louder than before. I could hear clicking as Ben pressed the buttons on his BlackBerry. I blew a piece of hair away from my face as I felt a hot flush rising through my body. I brushed the thin fabric of the sofa with my hand. Lovely sofas, I lied, so I could break the silence. Yes, these old things, charity shop finds. I bought them when... Mum? Ben was up on his feet alarmingly fast. He shoved his phone into the back pocket of his jeans. How about some of that cake? Ben rubbed his hands together. Annie regarded him for a second, and I sensed his agitation. Annie picked up the knife and held it in front of her as she looked at Ben. Well, let's just hope he's grown up enough to be functioning out there alone without his mum. Annie hooted. Then she sliced through the cake. He needs looking after from time to time, don't you, Ben? But that's what us women are good at. I suppose you may find that now, what with you being older. I glanced up at Ben, who rolled his eyes surreptitiously. The age gap had yet to make any impact on us. My 28 years to his 24 years hadn't created any problems. But apparently Annie was already searching for flaws in the relationship. Ben bent down, picked up a slice of Victoria sponge and began chewing with intent, a frown firmly fixed on his face. I watched Annie frantically trying to cobble together a small white porcelain plate and tiny dessert fork. I think what I want to know from both of you is why you decided to do it all behind my back. Annie held out the plate and fork to Ben, who had already finished his cake. She laid the redundant crockery back on the tray and patted her hair. And so soon after meeting. What about your mother, Daisy? Have you told her you're married? Ben sat back down again and tried to flash me an encouraging smile, but he seemed distracted. I paused and took a moment to breathe in so the rehearsed words would flow freely. She and my dad are probably over it by now. They're likely glad to have avoided the expense of a wedding. I laughed with too much enthusiasm and looked up at Annie's expressionless face. Plus, they live in Australia. Annie turned her body to face mine. They went without you? She screwed her face up in disgust. I cleared my throat and nodded. The faces of my parents flashed before my eyes, then disintegrated as quickly. I knew I didn't need or want to think about them, but I always did. She turned away from me, her attention on the tea tray again. Well, Ben is one of one, my only child, so being involved was important to me. Being told your son has got married 3 weeks after it happened is not what any mother wants to hear. Annie poured another cup of tea and held it out towards Ben. Son, your tea, she said flatly. Ben leant forward and took the tea and placed it in front of him on the table. He ran his large, soft hands through his thick, dark hair. Look, Mum, we've been through this already. If you want to blame anyone, blame me. I'm sorry. We're sorry. It was a mad... Ben paused. A mad spur-of-the-moment thing. The last few words fell out of his mouth. He looked at me firmly and spoke with intent. But we love each other, and that's that. I couldn't stop the smile that spread across my face, and the tension was already leaving my body. Words of apology were just forming in my mouth when Annie said, What's done is done. I can't do anything about it now, can I, son? I need to get the chicken in the oven. Ben raised his eyebrows at me, and I stifled a laugh. It was brought on by a bout of nervousness. The nervousness that was now leaving my body as Annie stood and walked out of the room. The atmosphere physically lifted. I looked at Ben, blew out the breath I had been holding, and raised my eyebrows in relief. At the kitchen table, Annie pushed the food around her plate and took tiny bites. This is delicious, Annie. The chicken is so moist. I prodded a slab of meat and watched the juice ooze out. How do you cook it? I'd do it in a brick. Always have done since Ben was a little boy. Annie placed her knife and fork together on the plate, indicating she had finished. Yet her plate still remained full of chicken breast and vegetables. Then Annie was on her feet. I noted how 60 years had treated her well. She had a very youthful face, with very few wrinkles, and that haircut made her appear at least 5 years younger. It was only because she displayed some stiffness when she walked that you might think this woman was nearing retirement age. Annie retrieved something from the dresser, then walked back over to the table and placed a small package in front of me. I glanced down and saw a delightful, neat square box, wrapped in silver paper with a thin pink bow on the top. I looked at Ben. He shook his head, just as surprised. What's this? I placed my knife and fork together on my plate and gently dabbed my mouth with the paper napkin. My heart started to quicken. I hadn't always feared present opening. I do remember a time as a little girl when tearing open the wrapping paper was done without inhibition. But then there was one time when I was in a room tentatively opening presents on a day that should have been filled with such happiness. Yet I had never felt more alone. And I guess that memory stuck harder. Well, open it and see, dear. Annie busied herself with clearing the plates. I carefully peeled away the paper, as though there could be something inside that might bite me. I stole intermittent glances at Ben, who shrugged his shoulders, indicating his ignorance. Inside the paper was a small grey box. I let out a small gasp. I imagined inside there'd be an antique ring or brooch handed down from generations, and now it was being given to me. The thought of owning something so precious and possibly expensive suddenly filled me with excitement. Maybe this was why Annie was so put out at not being involved with the wedding. She obviously had kept this for Ben's big day. The thought of receiving such a grand present when we had not involved Ben's mother or anyone else in our wedding made me wonder if we did the right thing by marrying so quickly. It had never crossed my mind before. I hadn't even invited my best friend Eve, and Ben never mentioned any regret. But the feeling reared itself, and so I prepared myself to shower Annie with gracious thank yous. I removed the lid, and there before me were words, bold in black, surrounded by a trail of flowers painted on a small ceramic plaque. Daughter-in-law, a child that destiny forgot to give you. My first instinct was to stifle the involuntary laugh that nearly came out. So when I did speak, my voice was high and strained. "Oh, thank you, Annie. That's so lovely, thoughtful. Isn't it? Look, Ben." I took the plaque out of its box and displayed it in front of Ben's face, to take some of the pressure off my own poor performance of gratitude. Only then did I see the back and realise the plaque was a fridge magnet, and probably the sort of thing you would pick up from a pound shop. "Well, that's gorgeous, Mum. So thoughtful. Well done." Ben looked at me and gave me a sympathetic smile. I realised it was not novel to him. This was possibly the sort of thing he received regularly. Annie eyed the pair of us up without smiling. She continued to remove the plates and walked away to the sink. "That's okay, son. I just wanted to get something nice that Daisy could keep. A little welcome into the family." There was a vagueness to her voice as she walked away. "That was nice of your mum," I said quickly, in a hushed tone. But I knew my expression did not match my words. Ben didn't have time to respond as Annie was back at the table. I forced my face into a smile. "I'll stick it on the fridge at home," I said loudly, and stuffed the box with the wrapping paper into my handbag, knowing it would stay there for many weeks, along with screwed-up receipts and packets of chewing gum. I turned to Ben. "Fancy showing me your room, handsome?" I stood in Ben's old bedroom, looking at the neatly arranged paraphernalia along the tops of the drawers and the endless framed photographs of Ben and Annie together. I noted that there was never anyone else posed with them. My mind flooded with 100 thoughts, all with one binding theme. How much did I really know about Ben? Here I was in his childhood home, having tea with his mum, and yet I could sense an absence. Annie's obvious dislike towards me was palpable, and the beach house bore a sadness, a feeling of loss. The missing parent in the photographs illustrated that clearly. I wondered if perhaps the lack of a father figure in Ben's life played a stronger role than he or Annie would ever admit. Ben had dived onto the double bed and was lying on his side, supporting his head with his hand. His dark hair, although persistently tousled, bore a slight shine from his shower that morning, and I was tempted, as I always was, to run my hands through its silkiness. He usually had some stubble, but today he had shaved for the occasion, highlighting his strong jaw and full lips. He blinked slowly and gave me the softest of smiles. It was hard for me to believe he had only begun moving out of this house 3 months ago, in September. We'd only been together for 2 months. But by then, we knew about the baby. Ben was overjoyed, and so began bringing more of his things from home to the apartment I shared with Eve. Now looking around Ben's old room, I could see how Annie had converted it into a museum, a shrine to her only son. It made me think about the rest of the house that I had seen so far, that bore no memories or photographs. It was as though Annie had wanted to cram it all into one room, away from prying eyes. I carried on looking around the room and made a show of pointing at various school certificates in neat wooden frames. "What?" Ben said in a high-pitched voice. "What can I tell you, Daisy? I'm a much-loved boy. My mother is very proud of me," he said with definite sarcasm, and lay back on the bed, placing both hands under his head. I cocked my head and screwed my face into a frown. "What is it? Your golden balls in her eyes? Why is that so terrible?" "Come here," he commanded, therefore sidelining my question. I joined him on the bed, where we entwined ourselves around one another, each limb clambering for space. Ben kissed my neck, which made me squirm around. The sensation was just too much for me, so I began laughing hysterically. With the noise of my laughter, neither of us would have heard the floorboard outside let out a soft creak as it was relieved of the weight of a stationary body.
Annie. I knew there was something about my new daughter-in-law that was so familiar. She was striking in her overall appearance. Tall, long, golden hair, rosy cheeks. She was a handsome woman, there was no denying it. I could see what Ben saw in her. But there had been something else that played on my mind after they left. I had seen her somewhere before. I knew something about her. All I needed to do was cast my memory back a few years, when the face from the 60-inch TV screen had haunted my every waking hour, when I read newspapers back to back to follow the reports. That was when I had seen Daisy before. Her face had come to me unexpectedly among the chaos of those years. The article on her tangled in with the trail of words I read daily, checking, always checking. I remember her story, leapt out at me, and for a time distracted me from the face I didn't want to see. Initially, I felt sorry for her, looking at the photo of her in her school uniform, just a girl. But as I read on, I discovered there was more to a photograph than meets the eye. I had never forgotten that news story, and I had read a fair few. I read the papers for years, never wanting to miss anything. Then one day, I finally felt safe and stopped, but not before I had seen Daisy's story. So when she arrived at my house, I knew straight away I had seen her before. I could tell by the way she presented herself that she was holding tightly onto her past and that she was trouble. To arrive wearing red heels when pregnant, what does that say about her? That girl was danger. I was adept at knowing when danger was approaching, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to protect my son. After Ben and Daisy left, I sat alone in the front room, staring out through the window where the darkness had enveloped the view of the sea. Having returned from the shops and seen the face on the TV screen just the day before, I was still in shock, and now I was on extra high alert. I thought about the vast expanse of water just a few feet away and hoped it would protect me. Even through the darkness and the closed windows, I could feel its energy and its intensity. It soothed me. That feeling, brooding and melancholic as it was better than the nothingness I felt without Ben. His presence had been fleeting, but I could still hear the echoes of our conversations. I could see the empty tray from our tea, and the dishes were stacked in the kitchen from our lunch. But he was gone again now. He had slipped away too easily, and all I could think about was how I was going to bring him back. I blamed his father. He wasn't the man he should have been for that boy. I thought about contacting Rory on a few occasions as Ben grew older, but I was scared of how he would react. Scared of the man he had become in the time we had been apart. But mostly, I knew I was scared of who I had become since we parted. I was a mother. My pure, raw love was for that boy of mine, and no one else would ever feel from me the sort of emotions I felt for Ben. It was always going to be me and Ben, and no one else. Until he met her. Grace. It was a mild spring afternoon when I saw the advert in the local magazine. A lady who had a very large kitchen was running cookery classes from her home, and so I signed up, eager to improve before any children came along. I had an idea in my mind that when I became a mother, I would also become an earth goddess, capable of whipping up any meal for any occasion to appease my husband and satisfy my children's hunger. I arrived at Emily's house one warm mid-March morning and signed myself up for several weeks of cookery classes. Emily, with her large waist and ample bosom, looked at my name on the paper and said, "Grace, that was my mother's name." I took my place behind the large, circular counter and nervously eyed up the other women. Then my eyes fell upon the lady next to me, before my focus was moved to the little boy playing next to her feet. He was a bonny lad, only about 2 or 3 years old. I watched as he opened the door of the train carefully and shut it again without any force. Feelings came rushing back to me. Feelings of loss, a longing for all the dead babies. I was supposed to be a mother, so why wasn't it happening? Why was I being punished? I just needed my body to hold on to the next baby, that was all. I was determined to make it right. I thought that if I became the housewife I was meant to be, then the babies would come. And so the cooking was going to help. I needed my husband to look at me again with those eyes, just like he used to. He had been so distant recently. After the last baby, what was it? The 6th? Or was it the 7th? By this point I had lost count. I didn't mean to. The last 3 came and went so quickly I had simply lost track. I named them in the beginning, but he said I was ridiculous. If the babies were being stubborn, though it pained me too much to even admit it, at least I would be able to offer my husband something else in the way of homely wife skills until we were blessed with the gift. I thought we would be able to have dinner parties. I would cook for all his work colleagues, and people would say, "Oh yes, that wife of yours, she sure can cook. You've got a good one there." Then eventually the gaping hole in our marriage, that should by now have been filled with the joyous, manic messiness that children bring, wouldn't seem so empty and obvious. He came from a large Irish family. His parents were waiting to be grandparents again. I knew that I alone would never be enough for him. He needed me to have a child. I would start with the cooking, show how I could be a good wife, then keep trying for the babies. A miracle was sure to happen.
Daisy. People think we married too soon. Maybe we did. But when we found out I was pregnant, it felt like the right thing to do. Only time would tell. Maybe we should have done it the other way around and found out more about the other person before we committed our lives to one another. I will always remember the night I first laid eyes on Ben, in the club on the quay in town. I had seen him arrive while I was dancing wildly, then suddenly I was enjoying the sensation that he was watching me too. I couldn't stop looking at him as he made his way to the bar. Our eyes locked for a moment, and he smiled a bashful smile right at me before lowering his head. But after I went to get more drinks, the place where he had been standing had become a gap, slowly filling up with more sweaty bodies. It became an urgency, the desire to find him. How was it possible to have such a connection with someone from so far away, with no words? It was so hot, I felt I needed some air. But then suddenly, he was behind me. "Are you leaving?" I heard the voice as I headed towards the main exit. The bass from the club was a dull thud from behind the double doors as we stood, just the two of us in the foyer. I stopped, turned and smoothed a stray piece of hair against my head and raised my eyebrows. There he stood. Tall, thick, dark hair that hung around his ears, a hint of a stubble. He was still wearing his black leather jacket. It was old and battered, but it suited him, like it was made for him. Well, I'm not sure now, I laughed. You look, great. He pushed his hair away from his face and looked sheepish. His eyes darted between me and our surroundings. Thank you, I said, with a small, self-conscious smile. I felt the energy build between us in the small space. I went on to tell him that I was a fitness instructor, and after a few minutes he found the confidence to invite me back to the bar. We found seats amongst the chaos and ordered margaritas with salty rims. I hope I didn't appear creepy, following you outside like that. He was possibly feigning coyness as he tucked his long, thick, dark hair behind his ear. I couldn't help but be reminded of Michael Hutchence with his battered black leather jacket and sultry look. I looked down at his hands, which were large and looked incredibly clean and soft. They were hands that hadn't grafted. Is this your bag? Clubs like this? He asked. Sometimes. I'm with my flatmate Eve. We like to dance. Let off a bit of steam. You? Not really. I was persuaded by a mate to come in for a quick drink. We've just finished a gig next door. You're in a band? So he really was a rock star. Many. I go where the work is, take whatever.